July 17th, 1970, midnight. The dense, suffocating silence of the New Brunswick wilderness is shattered by the panicked breathing of 5 desperate men. They had just done the unthinkable, escaped the high-security stone walls of Dorchester Penitentiary. But for John Lee Parker, freedom lasted only until the sun went down.
Look.
Years later,
I'm tired.
sitting in a cold
you
interrogation
everything.
room with
nothing
eyes
else
that
to
had
say.
seen too much, Parker would whisper a sentence that still haunts the Royal Canadian Mounted Police to this day. Escaping was the easy part. Surviving that night, that was the real nightmare. 20 kilometers away from the prison, they thought they found a sanctuary in an abandoned, decaying farm. They were wrong. Inside that barn, they didn't just find shelter. They stumbled upon a man who claimed he had forgotten how to die. A man whose history stretched back to 1850s France. As the moon rose over the jagged tree line, the convicts realized they weren't the predators anymore. They were the prey. Tonight, we dive into the chilling, true testimony of the Dorchester Farm Massacre. What was hiding in the shadows? And why, after 100 bodies were discovered, did the only suspect simply vanish? Stay tuned. The nightmare is just beginning. The escape began at 2 a.m., a time when the world is dead and the guards' eyes are heaviest. John Lee Parker was only 27, but the weight of a life sentence had already aged him. Alongside him were 4 others: Jack Fisher, the hothead, Sam Wetmore, George Hannington, and Lemuel Fleming. 5 men with nothing left to lose, scaling the cold stone walls of Dorchester Penitentiary. Once their feet hit the damp New Brunswick soil, they didn't look back. They ran north, guided only by the pale moonlight and the sheer adrenaline of stolen freedom. Their plan was simple: cross the Memramcock River, turn west, and disappear into the vastness of America. But the Canadian wilderness is not a place that welcomes the desperate. Hours turned into a blur of shadows and thorns. They waded through freezing river water, their lungs burning with every breath of the crisp night air. By the time the sun began to bleed over the horizon, the adrenaline had evaporated, replaced by a crushing, bone-deep exhaustion. They were hungry, dehydrated, and paranoid. Every snapping twig sounded like a police dog, every rustle of leaves like a siren. That's when they saw it. Emerging from the morning mist like a ghost from the past was a lone farm. From a distance, it looked like a sanctuary, but as they drew closer, the freedom they felt began to sour into an unexplained dread. The farmhouse was a rotting carcass of wood and gray shingles. The surrounding bushes didn't just grow, they seemed to be reclaiming the house, choking the porch in a mess of tangled vines. The barn nearby leaned at a precarious angle, its timber groaning in the wind like a dying animal. "It's abandoned," Jack whispered, though his voice lacked conviction. They had run 20 kilometers thinking they were escaping the law. In reality, they were walking straight into a trap that had been set over a century ago. They approached the back door, unaware that the eyes watching them in the darkened windows did not belong to a man who feared the police. They belonged to something that had forgotten what it felt like to be human. The escape began at 2 a.m., a time when the world is dead and the guards' eyes are heaviest. John Lee Parker was only 27, but the weight of a life sentence had already aged him.
Alongside him were 4 others: Jack Fisher, the hothead, Sam Wetmore, George Hannington, and Lemuel Fleming. 5 men with nothing left to lose, scaling the cold stone walls of Dorchester Penitentiary. Once their feet hit the damp New Brunswick soil, they didn't look back. They ran north, guided only by the pale moonlight and the sheer adrenaline of stolen freedom. Their plan was simple: cross the Memramcock River, turn west, and disappear into the vastness of America. But the Canadian wilderness is not a place that welcomes the desperate. Hours turned into a blur of shadows and thorns. They waded through freezing river water, their lungs burning with every breath of the crisp night air. By the time the sun began to bleed over the horizon, the adrenaline had evaporated, replaced by a crushing, bone-deep exhaustion. They were hungry, dehydrated, and paranoid. Every snapping twig sounded like a police dog, every rustle of leaves like a siren. That's when they saw it. Emerging from the morning mist like a ghost from the past was a lone farm. From a distance, it looked like a sanctuary, but as they drew closer, the freedom they felt began to sour into an unexplained dread. The farmhouse was a rotting carcass of wood and gray shingles. The surrounding bushes didn't just grow, they seemed to be reclaiming the house, choking the porch in a mess of tangled vines. The barn nearby leaned at a precarious angle, its timber groaning in the wind like a dying animal. "It's abandoned," Jack whispered, though his voice lacked conviction. They had run 20 kilometers, thinking they were escaping the law. In reality, they were walking straight into a trap that had been set over a century ago. They approached the back door, unaware that the eyes watching them in the darkened windows didn't belong to a man who feared the police. They belonged to something that had forgotten what it felt like to be human.
Night didn't just fall on Dorchester Farm, it swallowed it. By 8 p.m., the New Brunswick wilderness had become an impenetrable sea of black. The only light came from a single flickering lantern and the silver slivers of moonlight piercing through the cracks in the barn's rotting timber. John Lee Parker sat on a barrel in the hayloft, his eyes heavy, his mind racing. He must have drifted off for only a moment, but when he jolted awake, the air in the barn had changed. It was freezing, so cold he could see his own breath, and it smelled different. A thick, musky scent of wet fur and copper filled his lungs. He scrambled down the ladder, his heart drumming against his ribs. "Jack! Sam! Wake up!" he hissed. He turned his gaze toward the center of the floor where they had left the old man. The chair was empty. The heavy baling twine they had used to bind him wasn't just untied, it was annihilated. Thousands of tiny, jagged fibers lay scattered on the dirt floor, snapped by a force that no human hand could possibly possess. There were no footprints, no sound of a struggle. Just an empty wooden chair and a silence so loud it made John's ears ring. "How?" George stammered, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. "I tied those knots myself. He was an old man. He was weak." That's when it happened. A low, guttural growl vibrated through the floorboards. It wasn't a wolf. It wasn't a bear. It was a sound of ancient, starving hunger that felt like it was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Jack?" Lemuel whispered, looking toward the back stables. "Where the hell is Jack?" Jack Fisher, the man who feared no one, was gone. He had been standing guard by the rear stable just seconds ago. Now there was only a yawning black void where he had stood. Suddenly, a scream ripped through the barn, a sound so primal and full of agony it didn't even sound human. It was Jack, but the scream was cut short by a wet, sickening crunch, the sound of heavy jaws snapping through bone. John backed away, his hands shaking so violently he dropped the lantern. As the light flickered out, the last thing he saw was a pair of glowing amber eyes reflecting from the darkness of the stables. The old man was gone, and the predator he had warned them about had finally come out to play.
Chaos didn't just break out, it exploded. Jack's final gurgling cry was still echoing in the rafters when the barn transformed into a slaughterhouse. "Run! The side doors!" Lemuel screamed, but his voice was thin, brittle with terror. The remaining 4 convicts scrambled through the dark, their boots slipping on old hay and something wet, something warm. The smell of copper was now so thick you could taste it on your tongue. They hit the side doors like a freight train, but they didn't move. The wood didn't even creak. It was as if the barn itself had become a tomb, sealed by a force beyond human strength. "Something's on the roof!" Sam yelled, pointing upward. Above them, the sound of heavy, rhythmic thuds traveled across the rotting shingles. Thud, thud, thud. It moved with the speed of a predator and the weight of a nightmare. Suddenly, a massive fur-covered limb, thick as a man's torso and tipped with claws like black obsidian, shattered through the hayloft floorboards. Sam didn't even have time to pray. The claws hooked into his shoulder with a sickening squelch. He was yanked upward into the darkness of the loft so fast it looked like he had simply vanished into thin air. Then came the sound that John Lee Parker would hear every night for the rest of his life. It wasn't just screaming, it was the sound of Sam being unmade. A wet, ripping noise, like heavy canvas being torn, followed by the spray of hot liquid raining down on the 3 men below. Sam's blood hit the dirt floor with a sound like heavy rain. "Get to the back, the tool room," John choked out, his eyes stinging with tears and sweat. They ran blindly, tripping over rusted farming equipment and fallen beams. Behind them, something landed on the floor with a heavy 4-legged thud. It didn't run like a man. It moved in terrifying, predatory leaps, its breathing a low, wet rasp that sounded like a saw cutting through bone. George tripped. He went down hard. Before John or Lemuel could turn back, a shadow darker than the night itself fell over him. George didn't scream for help. He only uttered one word before the darkness claimed him. None. He was a tough man, a lifer, a murderer, but in the presence of this ancient hunger, he was nothing more than a meal. John and Lemuel didn't stop. They couldn't. They were no longer men. They were rabbits running from a wolf that had been waiting a century to feed.
Morning light didn't bring peace. It only revealed the scale of the atrocity. John Lee Parker, half mad with terror, and Jack Fisher, whose left arm was a mangled ruin of shredded muscle and bone, finally reached a busy highway. When the Royal Canadian Mounted Police picked them up, they didn't see 2 dangerous fugitives. They saw 2 broken men, weeping and pointing back toward the dark heart of the woods. The police raid on the Dorchester Farm was expected to be a shootout. Instead, they found a scene of unnatural stillness. When officers climbed into the hayloft, they didn't find a monster. They found the old man. He was sitting calmly in a wooden chair, not the one he'd been tied to, reading a small leather-bound book. As the officers surrounded him with rifles drawn, he didn't flinch. He simply looked up, his silver hair catching the morning sun, and asked, "What took you so long?"
He was arrested without resistance, but as the forensic team began to excavate the barn floor, the case shifted from a 3-homicide to something that defied modern science. Beneath the stables, they found a concealed cellar. Inside, it wasn't just Sam, George, and Lemuel. They found the bones of over 100 people. Men, women, and children, some dating back decades. Every single bone had been meticulously picked clean of tissue. There were no tool marks, no surgical cuts, only the distinct jagged indentations of large predatory teeth. But the final blow to the investigators' sanity came from the farmhouse. Inside a locked trunk, they discovered a photograph, a daguerreotype from the mid-1850s taken in Sisteron, France. It featured a young man standing in front of a stone cottage. The face was unmistakable. It was the same man they had in custody. He hadn't aged a single day in over 120 years. The old man never gave a name. He never asked for a lawyer. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, but he wouldn't stay long. In the summer of 1984, the impossible happened. One morning, the guards at the maximum security facility found his cell empty. The locks were intact. The security cameras showed nothing but a flicker of static. He had simply vanished. To this day, the Dorchester farm remains a dead zone. No trees grow where the barn once stood, and locals say that during the peak of the moon, you can still hear a low, rhythmic thudding on the forest floor. A predator that has all the time in the world, waiting for the next group of travelers to lose their way.
The case of Dorchester Farm was officially closed decades ago, but for the people of New Brunswick, the story is far from over. The old man, the prisoner who never aged, the survivor of the 1850s, the man who forgot how to die, is still out there. Some say he's back in France. Others believe he never left the woods of Canada. Since his disappearance in 1984, dozens of hikers and travelers have gone missing in the vast forests surrounding the old penitentiary. No bodies, no struggle, just silence. Is it possible that the werewolf John Lee Parker described wasn't a separate beast, but the man himself? Or was the old man merely a keeper, tending to a hunger that has existed long before we built our cities? History tells us that facts are cold, but the truth is often much darker. When the wind howls through the New Brunswick pines tonight, ask yourself, was it just the weather, or was it the sound of a century-old hunger looking for its next meal? What do you believe? Was the old man a supernatural entity, a biological anomaly, or just a very clever killer? We want to hear your theories. Drop them in the comments below. We read every single one. If this story sent a chill down your spine, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. We dive deep into the world's most terrifying mysteries every week, and you won't want to miss what we found for the next episode. Until next time, stay out of the shadows, and if you see an abandoned farm in the mist, don't stop to rest.